Why would you build a custom guitar that looks like this, when you could make it look like this?
We're going to start off making the knobs, and I'm going to show you two different ways to cast these, but first, let's grab our materials. To make our molds, we're going to be using Alumilite's Amazing Mold Maker. We'll need something to make our mold inside of, so for this, I'm just using some disposable plastic cups. For our resin, we're using Alumilite's Slow Clear, and we will be tinting it with some of their various pigments. So, I do have links for the majority of these items down below, and a couple of discount codes where they're applicable, so hopefully that'll help you out. But there are two ways we're going to go about making these molds. The first approach is going to get these knobs knocked out a little bit quicker, but you'll be sort of limited in what you can do with them. I'll elaborate on that a little bit more later on. You ready to mix up some silicone? All right, awesome.
To make our forms, we mix up a 1-to-1 ratio of both parts and stir it up quickly since there's only about 6 minutes of working time. While I pour the silicone into the cups to make our molds, I pour as far away from the knob as possible so that way air bubbles aren't formed around it. Since we fully submerged the knobs in silicone, we'll need to cut the mold open to remove them and then use rubber bands to hold the mold closed when we cast new knobs. What's cool about this approach is that in theory the knobs will be ready to use right out of the mold since every detail on the knob is included in the casting.
Before the clear resin arrived that we were planning on using for these knobs, I wanted to go ahead and test out the molds just to make sure that everything would work out alright. The only problem is that I also cast these before my pressure pot arrived, so even though the knobs ended up looking pretty good, there were a couple of air pockets. If you're new to resin casting like I was, you might be wondering what a pressure pot is even going to do for you. By putting the resin under pressure while it's curing, any air bubbles that are present are going to be compressed to be so small that you can't even see them.
Mind's blown. You're welcome.
So if I had cast this first round of knobs in the pressure pot, all of those air pockets wouldn't have even been there. However, there was another reason that I didn't use my first round of molds for my final knobs. Since the opening in my original set of molds was so small, I had to use a syringe to fill them. And that also meant that I couldn't use a toothpick to swirl the resin and get any interesting looking patterns. So when I made my second set of molds, I didn't fully submerge the knobs into the silicone, and what that left me with was a mold that was much easier to fill, and I can definitely get a toothpick in there to swirl the resin and make some cool patterns. Let's make some knobs for your guitar.
Really?
Yeah. So we have some clear epoxy, but instead of it just being clear, we've got this color set, and what's cool is that it will shift colors.
Really?
Yeah.
I think I want to do this one.
You want to try the glitter?
Yeah. But then can we try this one?
Yeah, we can try those too.
Okay.
First, what we need to do is we need to mix up our resin. This is a little full. That's really clear, isn't it?
Yeah.
Throw a little more in there. Oh, funny. We want to make sure that our platform in the bottom of the pressure pot is level. And it is. With our first set of clear knobs in the pressure pot, let's switch gears real quick and talk about what we need to make our pick guards. So materials, we will need some epoxy. We'll need a mixing cup, some pigment, so that way we can make them look cool. We need either some mold release or some tape. We will need some toothpicks, so that way we can get those infamous swirly patterns. We'll need some plywood, melamine, or MDF to make our mold from. Now to mix up our epoxy, we've got a drill with a paddle attachment, but if you don't have a paddle attachment, you can just use a stir stick like you use for a gallon of paint or something like that. Now to assemble and seal up our mold. A lot of people like using epoxy. Personally, I don't really prefer to go that route anymore. Instead, I actually use a hot glue gun. I'll tell you why in a little while. We need a heat gun, so that way we can pop all of our bubbles. We'll need some gloves to keep our hands clean, an apron to keep our duds clean, and just in case things get messy, we've got some crocodile cloth to clean up. And just like earlier, I have links and a couple of discount codes in the description below for you. So with that said, let's get started on our pick guards. To figure out what size my mold needs to be, I grab a pick guard and I measure across and up and down. Then to give myself a little bit of leeway, I add an inch in both directions plus 2 times the thickness of the material I'll use for the walls of my form. And this extra space gives me a bit of wiggle room when I go to cut my pickguard out of the epoxy that I've poured. Before I put my form together, I cover all of the pieces with tape so that the epoxy can be easily removed once it's cured. Now, you could use mold release, but I've never had any trouble just using tape, so that's what I go with. In the past, I've used caulk to assemble my forms, but without fail, every single time I do, I either don't have any caulk in the shop,
Now, where did I put it?
or the tube I grabbed that I was planning on using is already dry. So, in a pinch this time, I grabbed my hot glue gun, and I'm pretty sure that this is the method I'm going to be using from now on.
You might be wondering why I don't just screw or nail the mold together. And the simple reason is because without something like caulk or hot melt glue to also seal up the edges, epoxy will just seep out of any small crack in the mold and leave you with nothing but a huge mess to clean up. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like my idea of fun.
Once I calculate the area for my mold for just a 1/4 inch thick pour, I need to convert that over to fluid ounces. Now, I don't know about you, but converting from cubic inches to fluid ounces isn't one of those things I remember just off the top of my head. But thanks to Google and that calculator my teachers always said I wouldn't just have in my pocket any old time I needed it, I know just how much epoxy I need to mix up.
Once the epoxy is mixed up and you've added whatever pigment you want to use, you can go ahead and start adding swirly patterns right away. But honestly, until the epoxy starts to set up, those swirls are just going to disappear and you'll have to do them again. I make sure that once the epoxy starts to set up and thicken, I add all the fun swirly patterns that we've come to know and love. And I make sure to pop those bubbles one last time with the heat gun before I let it cure for at least a couple of days. But whenever possible, I let it cure for about a week before I take it out of the mold.
Even though this round of knobs turned out way better than the first one, it's still not exactly what we're looking for because they're sunken on the ends and all of the glitter fell to the bottom of the mold.
Oh, that actually turned out cool.
Yeah, that's pretty neat looking. Push it up like that. Now, don't get me wrong, it still looks cool. It's just not what we were going after. So I'm going to pour a couple more sets with the glitter and a few mica powders to see if we can't get something that's exactly what we're going after.
One thing I really like about this low clear resin in comparison to normal epoxy is how quickly it cures and can be demolded. That can be a curse and a blessing though, because thanks to its quicker cure time, you also have less working time, so that means you've got to be prepped and ready before you mix it up. But because of this, I've been able to do multiple pours a day and try out a few different techniques. As the resin gets closer to my target temperature of 105, you can see how much thicker it is and that the swirl pattern is also a lot more noticeable as I mix it up. In an effort to keep things a bit more tidy, I grab a syringe to fill my molds this time, but I'm not really sure how much it matters since the silicone cleans up so easy anyways. After I give these knobs one last swirly, the lid goes on and I pressurize the tank to 50 psi for about 3 hours. Now, depending on how parsimonious you are, and by the way, that's just a nice way of calling somebody cheap, you can spend a couple of minutes cleaning out the syringe with some acetone, or you can just toss them in the trash. At $2.50 a pop, they're not terribly expensive, but that could add up pretty quickly if you're using a ton of them. I don't know, what would you do? Clean them or toss them in the trash? Thankfully, the last few rounds of knobs have turned out much better. They're not sunken on the ends since I've been overfilling the molds, and the pigments have stayed suspended well since I'm waiting until the resin is around 105 before pouring it. Now the trick is to just not ruin them on the lathe, which, of course, there is a real possibility of.
I decided to let the knobs cure for a full 24 hours before coming over here to the lathe, just to reduce the likelihood that they would get dented or scratched by the chuck. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you could hold items like this on a lathe, and the most common is probably going to be a scroll chuck with a set of pin jaws. But a couple of years ago, I picked up this guy. This is a collet chuck, and I bought it specifically for holding smaller parts that just need a little bit of work done to them.
The only downside to this type of chuck is that you have to have a collet that matches the size of the item you're working on. But thankfully, both of these knobs fit 2 of the collets I already have, so we're going to chalk that up to good clean living. Now, before you think you've got to go out and drop money on a metal lathe, which you most certainly don't, this 1940s era Logan was gifted to me by a family friend. And since it's fun to use vintage machinery whenever possible, I use it for stuff like this because it's easier to accomplish on a metal lathe than on a wood lathe. That said, if you don't have access to either kind of lathe, you can go about this at the drill press. Now, I haven't personally tried this, but if I didn't have access to a lathe, I'd be caught giving it a go. The only potential problem is that you'll be limited to what size this counterbore can be based on what bits you have available. And maybe this won't be an issue, but I'm just throwing it out there. And for all of you machinists, no, I'm not reading the dials, and yes, I would really love to have a DRO on this little machine. But I'm just turning by feel and taking measurements every now and then to get me in the ballpark. And I know this isn't the most accurate way to go about it, but for what I need to accomplish, it's working just fine. So, with all of the machining completed, I sand the area up to 2000 grit before polishing it with some compound. If I really wanted to go crazy with the shine, I could use multiple polishing compounds and some cotton buffs. But honestly, I think this came out great, and even better, it didn't take too long.
I realized I didn't mention this earlier, but when you're making the molds for your volume knobs, make sure to run in that set screw as far as possible. So that way, when it's time to drill for the set screw in your cast knob, it'll act as a guide to keep your drill bit nice and straight. Now, I know the next thing I'm going to say will trigger at least a few of y'all because it is a totally bobo way to do this, but since I don't have the right size tap, I'm actually just using the set screw to form the threads in this resin knob. Now, I promise, if I end up making a bunch of these, I will buy the right size tap so that way I don't have to go about it the wrong way, but if nothing else in the meantime, it gives y'all something to pick on me about, so have at it.
I'm always a little surprised at how well these molds stay together, even with a pour that's barely over a 1/4 inch thick. But prying a thin sheet like this off the base is seriously nerve-wracking, because at any moment, I'm expecting it to snap in half. Thankfully, I dodged a bullet. My daughter and I poured multiple slabs to make possible pickguards from, and to get them down to the right thickness, I first tape them to a sheet of plywood, so that way I can run it through the planer. I take off as little material as possible from the first side, and then flip over the epoxy slab and bring it down to just over 1/8 of an inch before heading over to the drum sander to clean up both surfaces and bring it down to its final thickness. After this, I switch over to a handheld sander and I sand both surfaces of the slabs up to 400 grit, and I make sure to blow off any dust before switching to the next grit. Now, this does more than just remove dust. It also blows away any grit that's fallen off of the sandpaper, and it keeps it from making deep scratches in the epoxy. I then wet sand up to 2000 grit by hand with just a touch of ivory soap added to the water to lubricate the sandpaper. Next, I cover this side in tape to keep it from getting scratched, and I repeat the process on the opposite side before heading to the buffer, where I'll use a series of buffs and compounds to bring these epoxy sheets to a nice luster. Off camera, I made a template of the pickguard from my daughter's guitar to make cutting things out a lot easier. And yes, I did tape both sides of the pickguard to keep it from getting scratched up at the router table or drill press, because the last thing I'd want to have to do after all that sanding and buffing is remove some scratches.
In the video where my daughter and I built her kit guitar, a handful of people said that they would paint the backside of the pickguard or cover it with something like foil tape so that way you couldn't see through this. Now, personally, I think it's kind of neat to be able to see what is behind the pickguard on the guitar. It's just unique. But if that's not the look you're going for, by all means, paint it, cover it with foil tape. I don't know, do something.
At this point, I am really excited to see all of these custom parts come together on my daughter's first guitar. And I can't wait to see her reaction.
So, what do you think?
It looks really awesome.
It does look good. It came out really good.